Is the Wagner mercenary chief calling that the Ukraine offensive has already started? Is he just blowing smoke, or is he on to something? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's May 4th, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first, I want to take a look. There's not actually been any updates to the control map in 2 days, which is sort of unusual for midweek. But let's take a look at the combat map. And as you guys can see, just 40 attacks launched by Russian forces over the last 24 hours. What's most interesting is they are almost perfectly dispersed along the axes of advance axes of attack that we've seen from Russia up until this point, right? One attack literally every couple dozen miles. And it's sort of interesting because this looks less like a true offensive effort by Russia, and it looks a lot more like spoiling attacks or fixing efforts, right? Where Russia will either try to disrupt Ukrainian attacks before they happen by sort of attacking first, or try to fix Ukrainian forces in their current positions, because it's really hard to reposition forces when they are under attack. So it may be an effort just to prevent Ukraine from reshuffling its forces in preparation for the counteroffensive. But when we look at the real story, right, the one I really wanted to talk about, which is Prigozhin says that the Ukraine counteroffensive is already underway. And this is interesting because Prigozhin, if you guys have been following the channel, you know he's had a little bit of a pivot in terms of his personality. And he's tried to position himself as a sort of juxtaposition against the staged, managed, highly polished, suit-wearing, Kremlin bureaucrat class. The Russian Ministry of Defense, right? They're rarely photographed outside of their dress uniforms. They're often in these very opulent office buildings. And that is where they attempt to govern. Their statements about the Russian military are always incredibly favorable. And Prigozhin has tried to do the opposite of that. He speaks directly to people, often not through press releases, but instead through services like Telegram or even on social media videos. He wears combat gear. Often we looked at a video that'll go live in the next couple of days where he's wearing a plate carrier in Soledar. And he also has changed his message a lot. He speaks it sarcastically or in jokes, right? In a way that sounds more like your cynical uncle and less like a staged, managed, propaganda filtered Kremlin politician. But most importantly, one of the things that Prigozhin has started doing is speaking uncomfortable truths. And it seems like at least a segment of the Russian public really appreciates it. For example, he has acknowledged that the Russian Ministry of Defense has been running this war ineptly, something that only mill bloggers to this point have said. He has acknowledged that the Russian Ministry of Defense has failed to supply Wagner Group, and that Wagner has taken significant casualties as a result. He has said a lot of things that are surprisingly true. He said that the Ukraine counteroffensive is likely to succeed. So really uncomfortable truths is sort of become in the last several weeks and months Prigozhin's MO. So when he says this, I actually give it more credibility than I normally would give a Russian propaganda mouthpiece. But it's not clear. Again, he's not a military, he's not a retired general. So he doesn't necessarily have a broad military background to make accurate assessments. And when he does, they're couched in Soviet and Russian doctrine. So let's see if we can tease out what he said, and I'll try to translate it to Western doctrinal speak. Basically, he has said that the counteroffensive by Ukrainian troops has already begun and that his forces were observing heightened activity along the front. In an audio message published by his press service on social media, Prigozhin said the active phase of the counteroffensive would begin in the coming days. He said, quote, "I believe that the advance of the Ukrainian army has already begun. We are seeing the greatest possible activity both on the perimeter and within the front lines." He continues, I therefore believe that it has already started, and I believe it will enter an active phase in the near future. It could be a matter of days. So what exactly does he mean here? Well, what he means by active phase, I think what he's describing is that that there is an increase in activity along the front lines, but what I think he's seeing is a shaping operation. And a shaping operation in NATO doctrine is operations you undertake prior to the main attack or the main offensive action in order to set conditions to ensure the offensive's success. And shaping operations can take all sorts of different forms. But what he's describing Ukraine doing probably is serving three main purposes. The first is reconnaissance. They're probing attacks. So Ukraine is likely increasing its activity across the front lines in order to test where Russia has placed its defensive structures, how they engage in their defense, right? So like what sort of weapons do they have? When do they start firing? Even things like when do they commit their reserve force? How big is their reserve force and how long does it take? And if Ukraine has good signals intelligence or is getting good signals intelligence, it seems highly likely that Ukraine will also be able to observe in real time as Russia makes command decisions in, say, their command headquarters, where they decide when do we commit our reserves, and they get to watch that decision making in real time. That is going to help when the main offensive comes. It's going to help Ukraine understand when they can expect to see Russian reserves, when they'll commit them, etc. The other function is that it is serving as a fixing effort. And we've seen enough videos to know that if you're a squad size element, right, you can withdraw from a position under fire. But if you are a 200 person company or larger, withdrawing under fire is really hard. It's hard. You have to pack up all your gear. You have to conduct an orderly withdrawal. Someone has to stay in contact with the enemy. It's almost impossible to do. And so by launching an attack across the front lines, Ukraine is fixing Russian forces, at least some Russian forces, in position, that it will be hard, if not impossible, for them to withdraw under fire. And that means that when the offensive does come, that Russia will not be able to rob Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. It won't be able to pull its existing troops off the front line and send them to patch holes in its lines where the main thrust of the counteroffensive has taken shape. And the final effort is, did I talk about deception? Yeah. The third one is going to be deception, right? The idea is that they're going to keep guessing where Russia is going to continually be guessing where the counteroffensive is coming. Because if heavy artillery and occasional attacks are the norm across the front lines, there's not going to be an obvious indicator of the exact place and location of the actual counteroffensive effort or efforts. And I think that is really critical for Ukraine, right? To keep Russia guessing, unable to actually build the defensive effort that it wants, because it simply can't do so when the potential counteroffensive is coming from so many lines. Anyway, guys, that's just a way to think about this sort of situation. As always, if you want to support the channel, you can check out Ground News. They're a big supporter. They give us a whole bunch of information. Actually, this reminds me, this story, of one other point that I wanted to make about shaping operations. And that is that oftentimes shaping operations, but he goes and kind of alluded to it. He said it's on the front lines. And he says within the front lines, but he means behind. And behind the front line shaping operations is a classic U.S. move. The U.S. loves to disrupt enemy logistics and C3, command, control, and communication. So I think it's highly likely that Ukraine is using its drones, HIMARS, long-range artillery to strike Russian positions where there are supplies being held, supply depots, as well as communication hubs. So company, battalion, brigade level headquarters, communication relays, anything that's going to enable Russia to coordinate its defense. Ukraine wants to degrade it. And we can see that, of course, fire extinguished at Russian oil refinery after drone attack, right? Oil products reserve in southern Russia was attacked by a Ukrainian drone. This seems likely to have been a true event. But what's I thought was most significant is that, again, this is part of that goal. The diminishing Russia's ability to produce petroleum fuels is, again, now, is this going to affect the next week of Russian fuel production for its troops? No, probably not. But this is part of a longer term objective to diminish Russia's ability to supply and mount an effective defense to this counteroffensive effort. And this is how you're going to see these shaping operations take place. They generally, if you want to disrupt logistics, you have to work your way from out to in. You have to disrupt deeper logistics, right? Further behind the lines. And then you'll slowly start to disrupt more and more down the line, because what happens is you create cascading effects. So if you diminish the oil production facilities, and then you take out oil storage depots, and then you take out actual fuel points, the fuel points are going to look to the depots for replenishment. The depots will be shorthanded. They're going to look to, again, the refineries for replenishment. I'm oversimplifying it. I know, but they're going to look back to the refineries for replenishment, and the refineries are going to go, we don't have anything either. And so what you have is this cascading collapse of a logistics system if you do it right. The U.S. military, very good at this sort of thing. You can always count on the U.S. to have overly convoluted supply chains, but it means we know how to screw up a supply chain, okay? The U.S. military does anything. If you've been in the military, you know that waiting for parts for months and months is just classic. It's just the emblematic thing that you do in the military, no matter what position you're in. And then when the parts finally get here, there's always something wrong with them. And that's when, in peacetime, in a functioning logistics system, so you can only imagine the madness of a wartime logistics system that an enemy is actively trying to disrupt. Anyway, that is all I had for you guys. Thank you so much. As always, check out combatvetnews.com, check out Ground News, and of course, a huge thank you to the lieutenant tier members of combatvetnews.com. You guys make this possible, but a huge thanks to our Colonel tier members. Your support means the world to me. You guys are absolutely crushing it. You guys enable me to do what I do. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.